Fantastic. So hello, everybody. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Kristin Elton, and I am the Program Director for the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. And today we're going to be talking about Phragmites from the context of being a new to us problem. There's lots of work going on and historically across Ontario and the States, but Phragmites is a new beast that we're trying to tackle here in the province. So we'll talk a little bit about the approach that we've taken and the partnerships that we've been working with to try and do something about it. So we'll jump right in. Just a little bit about the council. We are relatively new with full-time staff. I came on the project in 2019, and that's the first time we've had a full-time staff member with the council. Since then, we've been growing astronomically. There's lots of work to be done. Our goal is to try and protect New Brunswick's our environment and economic and recreational interest from invasive species. So not just from an ecological standpoint, but from a more holistic approach. And the main work that we do is education and awareness about invasive species, trying to facilitate collaboration to improve management, particularly strategic management across the province as a whole, and then also trying to build capacity for some of the on-the-ground management activities that we need to start seeing more of in order to actually start tackling these invasives. So today I'm going to be talking about Phragmites, and this project is actually kind of an example of all three of these things and our activities rolled into one. So a little bit of context about New Brunswick for those of you who aren't familiar. Welcome, bienvenue. We are a bilingual province. I found this quote. It's actually in relation to COVID-19, but there's some pretty good parallels. A reporter in CBC described New Brunswick as being old, small, or we're small, we're rural, we're old, and we're spread out. Just to kind of give you a sense of our demographics, we're a very small province, only about 780,000 people to begin with, or as a whole, I should say. Some people refer to us as the drive-through province because you're driving through it to either get to Nova Scotia, PEI, or Quebec and Ontario, and not many people stop. But we are not all, so we're not just forests and the Bay of Fundy. We do have a lot more to offer. We have a lot of different habitats, and a lot of that is coastal dunes, mud flats, some amazing wetlands, which does come into play when we're looking at the threat of invasive species. So a little bit of background on Phragmites in New Brunswick. We do have native Phragmites. The first record of the invasive subspecies in the province was in 1981. And this was, we actually just figured this out today, I won't lie. We found a really great paper, Catling and Mitro from 2011 did an assessment of distribution across Canada. So we were able to find out when at least the first record of the invasive subspecies was. In 2000, the Flora of New Brunswick, second edition book lists Phragmites Australis without a subspecies as just uncommon. So kind of demonstrating that it, at least at that point, wasn't on many people's radar, and we weren't seeing it. And then the other interesting thing about Phragmites that I just want to note is that one of the things that people have struggled with is that it doesn't seem to act the same as it we see it doing elsewhere, in some cases here in New Brunswick. So we're not seeing it grow as tall. We don't get it to those 4-meter high heights that we talk about in Long Point. Sometimes, it's interspersed with other species and we're not sure, is that a monoculture or not? So there are some questions still remaining there, which I'll get to a little bit later. So also just to give you an idea, this is from that same paper that we discovered. This is just kind of a time lapse of the distribution. So this is from 1950. You can see New Brunswick here, nothing yet. We zoom forward to 1970. We're starting to see a lot more in Ontario, Quebec. This bubble in Nova Scotia is getting bigger. 1990, by that point, you can't even differentiate between the dots in Quebec and the St. Lawrence. We have had our first kind of occurrence in New Brunswick. And then by 2010, we've got our two known locations that had at least been recorded and that there were specimens for. This doesn't show Maine. Just below us, we do share a pretty significant border with Maine all the way along our western side of the province. And they do also have invasive species, invasive Phragmites. So often we say, we've got populations in Nova Scotia, we've got populations on the west in Quebec, and then we've got populations to the southwest of us in Maine. And for those of you who are Jurassic Park or Jurassic World fans, this is kind of what it feels like from the perspective of trying to manage, or at least figure out what to do to manage our invasive Phragmites populations. So now what? One of the things that's interesting is 2 out of 3 of our staff at the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council are from Ontario, and we are very familiar with Phragmites. I grew up on the shores of Georgian Bay, and I witnessed them come into the area and completely take over. So we're very aware of it. There are a few people who are very aware of it. One of the staff members, Paula Noel at Nature Conservancy of Canada here in New Brunswick, was asking around about it, and 2015 time about, are these the invasive populations that we're seeing elsewhere? It was suspected as such, but very limited data. But essentially, there's a few of us. We know that invasive species, or the invasive frag, are around us. And the idea is that we're not really sure what to do. We know it's a problem, but we're trying to remain calm. So how have we actually gone about doing this? That's what I want to talk about the bulk of today. And I'm going to talk about our approach. And I will say off the bat that the approach has been a very collaborative effort across all aspects of it, and that we are kind of in this early stages of figuring out exactly what should we be doing and where do we go from here. So our approach that I'm going to talk about today is, we've assessed the issue, try and get the collaboration happening, fill in the gaps of our knowledge that we don't know, or information, and then we're thinking about how do we plan our next steps. And the bulk of this work that we've done so far is trying to fill in the gaps here, because there are quite a few of them. So in order to actually identify those gaps, first thing we did was kind of try and take stock of where we're at, looking at what we do know. As I said, we know that we have the native Phragmites in the region. We are assuming that we have populations of the invasive Phragmites, and I'll kind of put an asterisk there, and I'll talk about that in a second. And we're seeing what we suspect to be invasive ones in the Moncton region. It's the largest urban center in the province. It's fairly close to the Nova Scotia border. There's a lot of tidal marshes and really good habitat for it there. So it's not unsurprising that we would see it show up there first. There have been reports of sporadic locations elsewhere. And we do have had some pre-existing data on where these species were. So there's the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center that had some information. iNaturalist.ca has been, since people have started really using it, we're getting more and more location information on there. There was a study done by the Nature Conservancy of Canada around the Moncton area and what's known as the Chignecto Isthmus, which is basically the area of the land bridge between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. That was done in 2018. And then there was also some specimen data in the UNB Connell Memorial Herbarium, which is actually, I believe, where the specimens came from that study that I mentioned earlier. So that's kind of what we do know. What we don't know is the extent of the invasion. We don't know where else it is in the province. We don't know how large the populations are. We don't know whether it's spreading quickly, if it's spreading at all. And then this big question that's also floating around is that there's a lot of kind of different opinions on is it actually the invasive subspecies or is it hybridizing? And the reason for this is because, as I said, we don't see it acting the same way we would expect it to, or having the same features we would expect it to in other places. So trying to figure out, is it perhaps a hybrid out here? Maybe it's something to do with climate that's restricting its growth if it is the invasive species. But that question still kind of has been looming up in the air for a while. And we kind of want to figure out what the answer is to that. And then the other piece, that things that we don't know from a personal standpoint and from, local skill set, is really how to tell the difference between the invasive and the native in the field, which will come into play in a second. Now, I just want to show one picture of what I mean by, the plants not kind of showing their characteristic, invasiveness. This is a patch that we found by a railroad. And you can just kind of see up in the top here, just the heads of this, the frag. It's kind of in a wet area. It's in a ditch, but it's definitely not taking over. There's a lot of different other species mixed in there. And this is actually an invasive one as identified by the herbarium. So, if it is invasive and we're not seeing its characteristics, you can understand why it might be hard and there might be questions about what's going on with this plant in the region. Okay, so we figured out what we don't know. We figured out what we do know. Where do we go from here? We've teamed up with the Nature Conservancy of Canada here in the Atlantic region in New Brunswick to kind of dig into these questions. It was a natural fit. They had already done some previous work on it, so we partnered with them to kind of try and fill these gaps together. Now, between the two of us, we have the Nature Conservancy who, they've been managing lands for a really long time. We've got staff that are now dedicated to doing this kind of work because the Nature Conservancy has a whole bunch of other priorities as well. But there was another big gap. And as I said, that is actually the botany knowledge to figure out what is going on. So I just want to do a shout out to the University of New Brunswick, the Connell Memorial Herbarium that I mentioned earlier. They kind of signed on the project as a partner, and I don't know, we didn't realize how much of an asset they would be. They've really come through for us in terms of helping us with identifications and trying to nail down what is invasive and what's not. Okay, so we're collaborating, we're moving forward. The next big gap, there's a couple gaps actually that we determined. The first one has to do with awareness. So there's two kinds of gaps in awareness that we identified. The first being just general knowledge amongst the general public and about, people who are, might generally consider themselves to be, outdoorsy naturalists who don't know about Phragmites, and particularly can't, really tell the difference between the two. So the goal of wanting to increase awareness about this plant is to try and bring when the awareness occurs further down this invasion curve, which I'm sure many of us has seen, but for those who don't, basically this is just a time lapse and likelihood of how much you're going to be able to actually control the invasive species once it arrives. But the idea is that normally by the time the public becomes aware of it and it becomes a problem, and people are pushing for something to be done about it, it's usually too late. So what we're trying to do is increase awareness, bring that awareness down the curve to where eradication or at least management would be more successful. So we've been doing that. We've put an iNaturalist project together for citizen scientists who kind of get on board. And even for people who don't know what it is, but happen to throw it on there, our project's going to catch it. We did a webinar for identification with NCC along with some other species and with NCC and PEI as well. We've done some social media and then we're also developing some ID resources. So I have some example here. We're putting together basically a card deck that'll go on a binder ring for people to collect them all. Our invasive kind of fact sheets, small little card to show people generally what invasive Phragmites are. As I said, we've got our iNaturalist program, and then we did some social media, and we actually kind of packaged this social media post and sent it out to different partners and asked them to send it out to their audiences just to try and increase the reach of this messaging. Okay, so the next thing that we did, the other gap that has to do with awareness is actually amongst environmental professionals and, the real enthusiasts. It was interesting, as I said, coming from Ontario, I was assumed that everybody kind of knew what invasive Phragmites were, but that wasn't the case. A lot of people, people working in the field with environmental and watershed associations weren't aware of what Phragmites are, let alone how to tell the difference between invasive and native. So what we wanted to do was really try and increase the awareness amongst those, on the ground professionals who would potentially be able to help us with this project. And this kind of also came, the realization that people didn't really know as much about this invasive species as we assumed was we decided to host a workshop that would teach people how to ID the difference between the native and the non-native. And some of the questions we got were, what are Phragmites in the first place? So kind of had to shift our thinking a little bit and start to realize that we actually have to do a bit more, take it a step back even more and get people aware in the professional field out here about what Phragmites are. So we did this workshop, we hosted it, but the Connell Memorial Herbarium, the staff there and volunteers there, Gart Bishop, Elizabeth Mills, and Robin Short were the ones to actually deliver the workshop. We learned a ton, some really, really fine details. We were looking at, parts of the plant under the microscope. But we had folks there from the New Brunswick Nature Trust, Ducks Unlimited, the Nova Scotia Invasive Species staff came out, basically trying to figure out, okay, what are the distinguishing features and how are we going to distill those into an easy to package way to describe to people so that when we're actually out in the field, we can properly identify between native and non-native. So we also did some resource development for that. So this is our field guide that's kind of a work in progress. It's meant to be folded up. It'll be like a brochure. But when it's folded out, basically it's a resource that's a little bit more descriptive than the small card that we made for the public, basically describing the different features and the different pieces of the plant to look at in order to pretty confidently decide if it's native or Phragmites. It is a work in progress, as I said, so ignore the fact that it's actually brome grass at the top of this and not Phragmites. But the idea is that, we basically have distilled it to looking at the height and density, the color, looking at the flower heads, using descriptions for the public and practitioners, like they look more fluffy, talking about the texture and color of the stem, and then other features like the actual stems and the nodes. And these are things that, while they're not necessarily definitive and they might be easier to trick us, unlike say the glooms or the really the florets on the actual flower head, these are things that we can actually feasibly ask partners and people to look at in the field. So we're also trying to, next step for that and trying to get our data, now that we're starting to create this awareness amongst people, is we want more data about where invasive Phragmites are in the province. So first step was to figure out who's going to be collecting the data.
2 minutes.
Oh my gosh. Okay, the second one is what we're going to collect, what data, and then how we're going to collect and compile it. So those last two ones are based on what we want to do with the data in the future. We did a blended approach to this. We, staff at NBISC did targeted roadside surveys. NCC did some incidental ones. We've asked partners to submit observations when they can. We've decided to do ideally, we're just looking for the patch location and size. We don't need to look at abundance within the patch or anything like that. And sometimes we just use point data when the other stuff isn't feasible. So if it's on a major highway or something like that. And a big shout out to the staff at NCC, particularly Alice and Patrick, who helped us put together an Arcgis field map tool. Overall, this is kind of where we were able to map and our surveyed routes. We didn't get to everywhere in the province, so that's something we want to work on. But what we determined is that there is a lot more Phragmites, the invasive, than we anticipated. And not just that there's more of it, but that it's in places we didn't really think about, or it kind of made us think more about how we're going to go about managing it. So we didn't expect the size of patches that we found. We didn't expect to find it in places, we were thinking we'll drive the major roads and that should be a pretty good indicator, but we were generally finding it on, randomly on a back road somewhere. And there's a 300-meter patch that we would never have caught if we didn't happen to take a wrong turn. Interesting, little anecdote. We found a huge patch of it in behind a car dealership where they had all of their their service center, and it was all a bunch of vehicles lined up that would be on the side of roads, like DNR, first responder vehicles, all that kind of stuff. And it was a huge patch of Phragmites, so that got our wheels thinking about how it's moving around. And then we also want to do some ID verification. So answering that question of like, is it actually invasive frag? So we did kind of a triple check approach. We did our field ID, and then we actually collected full plant samples that we sent to the Connell Memorial Herbarium, and their staff and volunteers really double checked for us. They're the botany experts. Really happy to report that we were pretty accurate in our field ID, which is great, including the one that we sent in that was a specimen collected from somebody who was selling bundles of the frag at a farmer's market. And then the other interesting piece that we're doing that NCC has kind of taken the lead on with this is some genetic testing of leaf samples that we've sent in. The analysis is underway, but this will really help us get to the bottom of, is hybridization happening, and is that why we're seeing some different characteristics? So stay tuned for more on that. And then our next steps, we want to get more data. So more rural areas, more northern parts of the province. There's some areas where, there's huge patches of frag and there's lots of them, and it's just not feasible for us to get to everyone and map them by foot. One of which, this is a satellite view of the Moncton area. Lots of coastal wetland right in here, mud flats. This is where the tidal bore comes in. So we're looking at maybe doing something like using drones to try and map that, and over time. And then the other thing that we want to do is do more targeted data collection with groups and partners. So this idea came about when one day I was driving down the road, saw a patch, figured I would just get it when I drove back the other way. And by the time I drove back, the roadside mowers had actually gone through and mowed down the vegetation. And it got me thinking that they would be a really good group to work directly with, to say, hey, when you are literally in the center of a patch of Phragmites, map it. Rather than just saying, in general, roadside staff, because those mowers are the ones who are there, who are literally seeing it in front of their faces. And then the other step that we want to do is a risk analysis. So the whole goal of this is to be able to do something with the data. We know that full eradication is not possible. So what can we do to manage the impacts as much as possible? And hopefully do management activities like trial removal. So what we're going to do is this kind of approach that we've fairly simple, looking at the areas of concern, like significant wetlands, recreational areas, looking at the available pathways that Phragmites could use to get there, and then also looking at where are the known populations of Phragmites, and are they close enough to those pathways that they could pose a problem. And then through that, we can kind of identify where our areas of priority could be. So I just have a couple examples illustrating this. These are some patches. Again, this is in Moncton. That is, unfortunately, there's a lot more frag on here than is mapped, just because we didn't have time to go everywhere. It's a really area of concern. But you can see here, there's the stars are where the frag were. This is the main highway, significant wetland. If it's traveling, spreads through that highway, very easy to jump into the wetland there. We've got a natural pathway down the river, especially with that tidal bore moving things back and forth, a lot of opportunity for pieces and rhizomes to get moved around. Anthropogenic pathways, things like this is a railroad. So we've got a patch here, over time, could it use the railroad, eventually get to Jones Lake? And then things even, further, we've got another wetland. Sure, the frag isn't near it right now, but this is a pretty new open roadway around this area with a lot of disturbed soil that does connect to a patch of frag. And is it possible that that frag could, over time, use that roadway to make its way to that wetland area? I just want to thank our partners. As I said, we couldn't do this without them. I think it's, there's a few of us who have been raising the alarm, and hopefully people are hearing it. Again, the Nature Conservancy, the Herbarium, and then our funders, the Wildlife Trust Fund from New Brunswick, the Environmental Trust Fund, and then this project is also part of the ECCC Community Nominated Priority Places.